The World Affairs Council of Greater Reading is the leading educational organization promoting understanding and enlightenment on global issues. Welcome back. I am Mike. Thanks again for joining us today. We are live on Facebook. We've got our members joining us here on Zoom. We are going to have a live Q&A after the end of the prepared presentation today. So if you're joining us on Zoom or on Facebook, go ahead and start entering your questions into the chat as they come up. I do have everybody muted during the presentation. Also, you are on video. So if I know this is a lunch hour presentation. So if you're going to be eating while you're watching the presentation, go ahead and turn your camera off. It's just out of courtesy to everyone else. A great presentation come up. And without any additional delay, I'm going to turn the meeting over to our President of the World Affairs Council, Dr. Solomon Lausch.
Thank you, Mike, and good morning or good afternoon to everyone, just now passing noon. And we really do welcome Robert Daly to us today. He has as you read, if you read from our website about our program today, a very varied program, working everywhere from diplomacy, as an actor, as a TV producer. I think we're going to have a very interesting presentation. As you read, he was named as the second director of the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States at the Woodward Wilson Center. He's been there since August of 2013. He came to the Wilson Center from the Maryland China Initiative at the University of Maryland. And prior to that, he was the American director of the Johns Hopkins University Nanjing University Center for Chinese and American Studies in Nanjing. He has lived in China for 11 years. I believe he is actually married to someone who is native Chinese. I just learned that just a moment ago. Very interesting background. He has lived in China, as I say, for 11 years, has interpreted for Chinese leaders, and he has served as an interpreter for Jimmy Carter and Henry Kissinger as well. And we'll hear some more about that perhaps as we move along. Without any further introduction, welcome Mr. Robert Daly.
Well, thank you very much, Saul, and thanks to all of the organizers there at the Reading World Affairs Council. I'm very sorry that I'm not visiting you in person. I had been looking forward to it. I've never been to Reading. I've been a number of other parts of the state. I'm actually from northern New York near Syracuse. I've had a lot of my career here in the Washington area. And so I've driven across much of Pennsylvania, but I've also been able to visit a lot of the cities and towns there, but not Reading. So sorry that we have to do this remotely because of COVID, and I hope maybe in the future we'll have a chance to come and meet in person. So a lot has happened since I first was approached by the Reading World Affairs Council. A lot of water under the bridge, both in the United States, in China itself, and in U.S.-China relations. So I'm tempted in part to go straight into Q&A today because I'm sure that there's a lot on your mind, and I'd love to hear your views. But we did promise to kick off with a look at China's approach to U.S.-China relations and where that is. So I would like to begin by doing that, and then to offer some thoughts on where the new administration might have to go and what America's interests vis-a-vis China might be. So China, and I assume that many of you have probably been there, but you've at least been following matters Chinese, probably for decades in some cases. China is the world's oldest continuous civilization, and deeply aware of that and deeply proud of that. Actually, among ancient civilizations, Mesopotamia, Mesoamerica, Egypt, India, China is late to the game. It's the late arrival. China's great trick is continuity. Once China emerges as a major civilization, as diverse as it is, and in all the changes that it's been through, it has maintained a certain cultural continuity and cohesion, which is a big part of its self-concept now, the sense that the Chinese people have of themselves as a people, with shared history, shared ethnicity, culture, values, folk stories, shared projects, goes extremely deep. And it's actually, while it holds China back in some ways, it's also a great source of China's strength. So again, we're going to deal in very broad brushstrokes at the outset here. The world's oldest continuous civilization, and also for much of human history, the world's most successful civilization. For 1,000 or 2,000 years, depending on how you measure this, into the 19th century, whether it is in terms of economic success, expansion of empire, technological success, artistic and aesthetic success, success with models of governance. They invented meritocratic bureaucracy. China was extremely successful and was furthermore the lodestone of the world as it knew the world. Obviously, China is not European. They didn't grow up with the idea of Westphalian nation states. China was more a civilizational or cultural principle than a modern nation state. But it was, for the most part, unchallenged through most of its history. And so this reinforced China's sense of greatness, its sense that it was the Middle Kingdom, or that it was, as they used to say, Tian Xia, everything under heaven. And as shocking as that kind of claim may seem now, I would argue that it's largely merited from China's point of view for most of China's history. Not only was it the greatest nation in the world, its world being, the northeastern hemisphere at least, but China, like most countries, also has a mythology about its greatness that was repeated through education, through literature, through poetry, through song, deeply imbued. It goes back 3,000 years, and these folk songs and folk stories and this China sense of history get passed along. That's something that is, again, a little bit foreign to Americans. I teach a graduate course for Syracuse University. And earlier this semester, I forget what the particular topic was, but it might have been America's standing in the world. But what I wanted to say is that things have changed irrevocably with time. These are American graduate students, fairly well educated. And to make that point, I use the phrase, "The old gray mare ain't what she used to be." Blank stares. Not one of those students knew that song, right? Which my father and my grandfather and his father knew. We tend to pick up and put down cultural artifacts pretty quickly. The Chinese hold them up, hold to the light, and make sure that everybody sees it. And there's a deeper sense of China's meaning, therefore, as a civilization. So against this background of really unrivaled but also unquestioned greatness, China's great ego wound, the great shock to the Chinese system, both at the national level but also at the personal level, came in 1840 with the Opium War, when Britain, an upstart nothing island at the far end of the Eurasian landmass from China's point of view, defeats the great Qing dynasty almost overnight and begins what China's Communist Party leaders have called China's century of humiliation, the debunking of the idea of greatness, a challenge to everything the Chinese thought they knew about the country. And it was overtaken, again, by England through what, from China's point of view, was a very simple formula. China faced something that it had never faced before. The foreigners on China's periphery had never been a threat. From across the ocean, the danger that China had known on its periphery was in the north, where the Great Wall is, from nomadic people. So ocean power now coming across the sea to China's coast, which had never really mattered to China. The waterway that mattered to China was the Yangtze. And then most importantly, those foreigners from across the sea came with vastly better technology. So that was the formula for China's humiliation. Keep that in mind for a minute. Foreigners from across the ocean with better tech. 2 weeks ago, China's current leader, Xi Jinping, gave a speech commemorating the 70th anniversary of China's entry into the Korean War. And as one of the rhetorical high points of his speech, he said, "Our victory in the Korean War announced to the world that the era of several centuries in which a Western power could, simply by putting a few cannons on an Asian coast, take over an entire country, that era is over." So this ego wound from 1840 goes very, very deep for China. Why do I mention this formula? Foreigners from across the sea with better technology. As you know, Mao Zedong took over in 1949. His revolution succeeded, and he kicked the foreigners out. He gave China back to the Chinese. And this, against the background of the century of humiliation, what the Chinese call the century of humiliation. We need to interrogate that idea a little bit, which we can do in Q&A if you would like. But that return of sovereignty, return of China to China's control, makes Mao China's great hero. This is why his portrait still hangs over Tiananmen Square in the heart of Beijing, despite all of the nightmares and mass murder he would subsequently visit upon the Chinese people. Now let's get into the modern day in China's own narrative telling of its own history. Remember that China was the century of humiliation. China was never actually colonized, but its sovereignty was humiliated. China was certainly robbed, impoverished by foreign powers, insulted, exploited. And there were a number of times when foreign troops, including in 1900 when American troops, and later in the Yangtze waterboat era, we had American sailors, when foreigners basically could do as they wished on Chinese soil, although it was never actually a colony. China then went through a series of revolutionary and warlord disturbances, wars, regional wars, early in the 20th century. And then you had, on top of that, the Japanese invasion from beginning in 1931 to 1945, followed by the Chinese Civil War, followed by all of the Maoist campaigns like the Cultural Revolution, and especially the Great Leap Forward, horribly destructive, 60 to 62. During those 3 years, and again, this is, I think, to see the Chinese point of view, you've got to try to enter into an act of moral imagination here. In China, for 3 years, recently, 1960 to 62, because of a government-imposed famine, about as many people died in China in 3 years as died worldwide through violence in World War II. A country with a living memory of famine, a living memory of starvation, including the selling of children, cannibalism, the whole thing. This is part of China's modern inheritance. So when Deng Xiaoping took over from Mao Zedong in 1978, even though Mao had won plaudits from the Chinese people for kicking the foreigners out, Deng Xiaoping invited them back in. And he was very clear about why, quite explicit. Americans love to say, what does China really want? China usually tells you what it wants. You just have to listen. Deng said, yes, we're letting the foreigners back in for 3 reasons. We need foreign capital, we need foreign managerial expertise, and we need foreign technology. We need foreign technology. Otherwise, this country cannot have an economy. It won't have a polity. We must modernize. And Deng Xiaoping recognized the risks. He said, yes, when you open a window, you let in some flies. And what he meant by flies was Western thinking, sort of the inheritance of the Enlightenment, notions about the importance of the individual and transparency and democracy. These were the flies, but it was worth the risk because China needed tech, capital, and managerial expertise in order to develop. Well, now, 40 years after the beginning of Dengism, China has rebuilt its universities. It provides its own expertise. China is probably already the world's biggest economy. It's certainly the world's biggest trading nation. It can supply its own capital. And China has also developed its own technologies. It's stolen a lot of technologies too. It's borrowed, it's cobbled them together. But to say that China stole everything is wrong. That's an exaggeration. China's treatment of intellectual property is a major issue. President Trump and previous American presidents were absolutely correct about that, but we've sometimes overstated the problem. So China, having solved the problems of tech, capital, and expertise, that was Deng Xiaoping's rationale for letting the foreigners in. Now with the rationale gone, we find that China is in fact beginning to be less hospitable to foreigners. It has also, over the same period of 40 years, it has greatly secured its maritime periphery. It has built up submarine bases. It has 2 on its way to 5 aircraft carriers. It has relatively quiet nuclear subs. It has land-based missiles that can take out our aircraft carriers, no longer a very relevant fighting platform. And as you doubtless know, it has built islands, man-made islands in the South China Sea, which it has heavily militarized. So go back to 1840, this ego wound that comes with the defeat from England. And I said that the formula for China's humiliation was foreigners from across the sea with better tech. Now we find in 2020 that China is getting less hospitable to foreigners and is able to more or less control them within its borders. It has taken care of its maritime periphery by greatly strengthening its military and building bases. And it has also made the kinds of investments that you need to be a world technological leader. So you can think about China today as having fully learned the lessons of the Opium War and having overcome them. Now that's China looking at itself, at its own progress. You hear this talked about a lot in the United States as a China threat, China's rise as a China threat. For the Chinese themselves, especially coming out of the propaganda organs of the Chinese Communist Party, this is, of course, a narrative about victory, a great victory, long earned, beginning in 1840, at the expense of tremendous sacrifice. And this is a virtue narrative. This is a moral narrative about China standing up and having stood up, as Xi Jinping says, now wanting to move to center stage. This is a victory, and it's based on Chinese wisdom, Chinese patience, Chinese hard work, and Chinese victimization. It's a virtue narrative, and China is now seeking to do what probably any nation under its circumstances would do, which is to push out its defensive perimeter to include at least its region and maybe more of the whole world. It's trying to have an impact on global norms and global practices. It's trying to secure the food, the energy, the natural resources that its vast population needs. And again, no matter what challenge this may pose to us, and we'll come back to that, from China's own point of view, it's a virtue narrative. So China's triumphalist virtue narrative has been in some ways amplified, enhanced by China's changing narrative about us, about the United States. What form does that take? Because this is also very important if you want to understand China's current self-concept. In 1979, under Jimmy Carter and Deng Xiaoping, we reestablished relations with China after a period of Cold War estrangement in which we'd been killing each other directly in the Korean War and indirectly during the war in Vietnam, but we were certainly Cold War enemies. And when we came back together in 1979, China knew that it was poor and almost destitute, isolated nation. And China, in some ways, quite humbly realized that it had to study foreign models if it was going to become the kind of nation it aspired to be. And its most important model was the United States. And we were looked on as, in many ways, the exemplars and therefore teachers of a kind of how to attain military, economic, and political and cultural power. There was a period of not quite tutelage, but of several decades of China's intensive study of the United States to try to see what worked and adapt it to China's needs. It was never a whole-on borrowing, but there was, again, quite humble study, deliberate, systematic, policy-driven study of the United States and other countries as well, Japan, Germany. But the United States was always the model, which is to say that China, to some degree, took America's superpower status for granted. They felt subject to American power in ways they didn't like, but they were also students of American power in ways that were somewhat admiring. How did that cease to be the case? Quick timeline there. 1989, Tiananmen massacre. I'm sure you all remember it. This really changed the Chinese Communist Party's views of the Chinese people. They realized when their young students were calling for democracy and building a goddess of democracy statue that looked a lot like the Statue of Liberty, that Deng Xiaoping had really let in more flies than perhaps he intended. And those flies may have been more welcome than he perhaps knew. One of the lessons the Chinese Communist Party learned from Tiananmen Square is that it needed to pay more attention to education, to propaganda. It could not trust its own people, nor could it trust the United States. Next event that made a big impression on the Chinese was 1990 in the first Gulf War. And I was at the embassy in Beijing when this happened. So I sort of watched the first Gulf War with the Chinese. And the Chinese, like much of the rest of the world, were stunned by what they saw. Most Americans didn't realize what American military power had become. That we had technologies like smart missiles that could very narrowly target specific people and blow up their homes. You probably watched that war unfold on CNN. And seeing that, China and its People's Liberation Army, or PLA, were shocked. They realized that their military doctrines, the structure of their forces, the whole way they thought about the military, had no answer for American power. This was a revelation to them, and they became determined that they had to have an answer. They had to modernize militarily as well as economically. China then got another shock in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union, which had been China's big brother from 1921 until the Sino-Soviet split. Not only the Soviet Union, but China's close ally, Nicolae Ceausescu in Romania. All of the other communist nations seemed to be falling, with China left standing alone and feeling extremely fragile, knowing again that its young people liked American ideals and that its army had no match for American might. What did Deng Xiaoping do about this? In 1992, he made a famous journey to the south of China, in which he really sort of opened all the taps on China's development. This is when he said development is good. This is when he said, in violation of Communist Party doctrine, that some people had to be allowed to get wealthy first if the country was to advance at all. And so 1992, post Tiananmen, is really the beginning of China's go-go era. Of course, it takes a while to modernize your economy, to modernize your military. In 1995, we had the Taiwan Straits crisis. Without going into too much detail, China was lobbing missiles into the waters off of Taiwan to try to intimidate Taiwan before one of its elections. And then President Bill Clinton sent 2 American aircraft carrier battle groups into waters near Taiwan, and China had to back off because it did not have a military answer to aircraft carriers as force projection mechanisms, as fighting platforms. China was humiliated. It had to back off, but it nursed its wounds and it continued to make military investments. In 1997, China got and 98, China actually got a bit of a shot in the arm through the Asian financial crisis, in which China was widely seen and correctly seen as not devaluing its currency and therefore helping Asia as a region to recover from a major financial crisis. So this begins to show China that there may be possibilities for actual Chinese leadership, for norm shaping, not just a defensive response to American military or American ideals, but maybe actually China can be an admired leader that can shape the region. The next major event was 9/11 and the Forever Wars. And this was an extremely important event, again, from our narrow lens here, China's lessons, China's attitudes toward the United States and itself. What 9/11 and then our failures in Iraq and Afghanistan taught China was that the American military was vincible. It was a lesson about American military weakness. 11 years after, 10 to 11 years after the first Gulf War, which taught tremendous fear of what America could achieve. Beginning in 2001, China started to think about the United States differently. Maybe the United States is vulnerable but still dangerous. China's attitudes toward the United States, its suspicion of the U.S. and especially of our civil society organizations, non-governmental organizations, was increased in 2003 by Georgia's Rose Revolution, in 2004 by the Ukrainian Orange Revolution, the color revolutions, which China, like Putin's Russia, sees as plots engineered by American NGOs, like the National Endowment for Democracy, which in this telling are able to work as a sort of a fifth column for the United States and foment revolution. This is where China's determination to kick American NGOs out of China came from. So if you saw that in the early 2000s, then we get 2008, the global financial crisis. Very complicated phenomenon, but more or less our fault. So 2001 and the Forever Wars caused China to question America's military wisdom and military might. 2008 causes it to question our economic and financial intelligence. Maybe America doesn't have all the answers. Maybe China doesn't need the United States as a tutor anymore. And then with 2016, with the election and America's ongoing political, social, and cultural chaos and institutional weakness, this is the final debunking. So you get 2001, the myth of American military supremacy debunked in China's eyes. 2008, the myth of our financial and economic acumen debunked in their eyes. In 2016, the Chinese people themselves, not just the Communist Party, begin to deeply question American institutions. So the result is that China is no longer interested in the United States as a tutor. It thinks it can go its own way. It can find its own wisdom. It has, as it points out repeatedly, brought about 600 million people out of poverty over the past 40 years. A success, not a Chinese success, but a success in terms of human well-being. What they accomplished has never been done on that scale at that speed before. And this success of China economically is proof to China's leaders and many Chinese people that actually China may have found some of its own answers. Again, this is part of the virtue narrative, but the mirror image looking at the United States is now a widespread belief in China and in much of the rest of the world, both in political as well as in ordinary circles, that the United States is a declining power, a power in irrevocable decline, clinging in a disillusioned and dangerous fashion to what remains of its hegemony. And that's the lens through which China sees the United States now to a considerable degree. So where are we in the relationship? Well, the United States and China are now the world's two great superpowers. We are involved in what is going to be a decades-long global competition, every continent, both poles, outer space and cyberspace, to be not what Clinton called the world's one indispensable nation. That's probably beyond the reach of any nation at this point, and that may very well be something we should welcome. But they are competing to be the primary shaper of security architectures, trade and investment regimes worldwide. Very importantly, technology. Both sides agree that whichever nation leads in the development, marketization, and regulation of technology, that's the key to economic power, military power, hard power, and soft power. And these two countries are also competing in the normative space, in the ideological space, to be the nation with the largest single influence on global norms and practices, and the values that underlie various institutions. So, how does the United States respond to that going forward? The Biden administration will come into office on the 20th of January with an enormous to-do list domestically and economically. China is widely viewed as the United States' great, and I think correctly viewed, as our greatest long-term strategic challenge. And that is something now that is a consensus within both parties. And it's something that the American people, recent polling indicates, also agree with. China is trying to manage China properly is probably our single biggest geostrategic challenge. Now, that isn't to say that it's our greatest challenge overall. Pandemics, global inequality, trying to get to carbon neutrality, environmental issues may well be more important than the China question. But geostrategically, China is the big question. So what can the next administration do? A few thoughts, which are fairly consistent with what the Biden incoming administration has said. First, it needs to redefine America's interests vis-a-vis China. President Trump, I think, correctly and usefully changed the basic narrative on China to one that focused on the way that China's rise, aspects of China's rise, can challenge well-being in the United States and in other countries as well. I think there were many ways in which President Trump overstated and misstated this and badly mismanaged it. But in terms of shift, I think he has to be given credit for changing the way that America fundamentally views China sooner than we otherwise might have done. And I think that the Biden administration will largely share that view. But the Trump administration has mostly focused, especially in the past 8 months, in attacking China for all of the ways in which China is seen as a bad actor. And many of these critiques are true and legitimate. Some of them have the nature of mere insults for insult's sake. What has not been done is the traditional foreign policy move, which is to begin by defining America's interests vis-a-vis China. We have to be clear on this, not just what we dislike about China. There's lots of things in this world we dislike. What are our interests? And I would argue that there are three that should guide policy. One is preventing Chinese dominance of the Indo-Pacific region. not allowing China to have the ability to coerce neighbors, preventing Chinese dominance, but while making allowances for the fact, as we must, because there's nothing we can do about it, that China's power will be increasing. So we need to find a way to allow for, recognize, accommodate, whatever word you prefer, for China's growing military might and legitimate interests, while working with allies to prevent Chinese dominance, which would be a threat to our alliance structure and ultimately to our security. We also have to work hard to prevent China's illiberal influence beyond its own borders, through primarily, which China achieves primarily through leveraging its vast wealth. And then most importantly, and lastly, we need to, if possible, and this may already be too late, we need to avoid a new Cold War with China, a pillar of which is going to be a brand new arms race, which comprises not only conventional weapons and nukes, but also cyber warfare and the weaponization of outer space, which we've only begun to understand. I think there's a very good chance because of China that mutually assured destruction could once again become an organizing principle within the United States. Those, I would say, are our key interests. What steps can we take? First, the easy stuff, and the Biden administration clearly knows this. We can establish a better foundation to try to manage China relations merely by a global return to normalcy in our foreign policy. And what I mean by normalcy is normal diplomatic rhetoric. I also mean a normal bureaucratic approach to foreign policy. Now, bureaucracy has become largely a term of abuse in the United States. But in fact, the expert foreign policy bureaucracies, just like other expert bureaucracies, are essential. And when they are functioning in normal ways, they tend to mitigate against extremes in policy. President Trump's foreign policy has been largely personal and spontaneous, driven by himself. And it's been viewed by the rest of the world as highly chaotic. And we are now not trusted, including by many of our closest allies, because they need from us consistency. And they don't feel they've had it. But by re-enabling the expert bureaucracy in the Defense Department, in the State Department, and other areas, re-engaging in dialogue, a Biden administration can reassure allies and bring them more into America's camp vis-a-vis China. And that's probably the most important thing that he can do, is to strengthen our alliances rather than going after South Korea and Japan, who we very much need as a counterweight to China, threatening them with tariffs and asking them to pay American mercenaries to have outposts on their territory. We can work with them to heal the rifts between South Korea and Japan and to try to counter China, and it has common interest with us in that regard. Same is especially true of Europe, which shares our critique of China, but has had the Trump administration they found them very hard to work with. Now, the Biden team has also said, and I think this is a key part of policy, although there's a problem with it that I think we should note, that rather than simply attacking China for the things we don't like about China, our real mission is to compete with China more effectively by getting our own act together here at home, by strengthening our own institutions, by strengthening our economy, by having a foreign policy that works for America's middle class, and by reinvesting especially in research and development, education, and infrastructure in order to compete more effectively with China rather than merely throwing stink bombs at international fora. And of course, to compete effectively, we also need to look at our own economic disparities, both rural and urban. We need to look at healthcare, we need to look at immigration. Now, I think that is the right prescription, but there's also a problem with it. And I've seen a lot of this in Washington, and it's something that Washington is especially prone to, is you get all these people in the room who know this topic really well. In this case, US-China relations or diplomacy. And everybody says, yes, we really need to get our own house in order. This is a question of healing ourselves, being more competitive. And then we all congratulate ourselves on our capacity for introspection and self-knowledge and self-criticism, sort of wash our hands of that, and then proceed to do nothing because our government is largely paralyzed. And we haven't even proven able to reinvest in infrastructure despite bipartisan agreement over the past 4 years. So this can become, this talk of self-healing, getting our own house in order, which of course must be our first priority, But this is also the work of at least a decade with extreme good luck, but probably much more. So we can't, in the meantime, just be involved in national self-healing, while China, with the wind in its back, is on the move internationally. We have to find some way to both do the many extraordinarily difficult things that we need to do domestically while our country is extremely deeply divided. While we're doing that, we have to find some way to try to confront China and also to compete with it. And that, I think, is going to be the Biden administration's great challenge. And this, I said earlier that China knows, because of its cultural continuity, it knows what its national project is. Its national project is increased economic and technological development. And people are fairly unified behind that. They work for it, they sacrifice for it, they delay gratification for it. And its secondary goal is to increase its global status. But again, there's broad acceptance of this. And yes, there's broad acceptance in part because you have an authoritarian party, which is moving toward techno-totalitarianism, which controls all of media and can therefore enforce conformity of thought. That's true. But it's also true that China's relative cultural homogeneity, ethnic homogeneity, and its common history and historical experience, about which it has common myths, that those lead toward a national agreement, a national project. What's our national project? Do we even think that under these circumstances, we could have one? St. Augustine said that a nation should be defined as a community of rational beings in common agreement as to the objects of their love. I don't think that's where we are as a country right now. I'm not blaming either party. It's just a fact about the nation that we are facing our greatest geostrategic challenge, a real peer competitor, which we've never had in the form of China, just as we seem least able to meet it. And meeting the China challenge, I think, can't wait for us to get our own act together, whatever that might mean. It certainly can't wait until all Americans agree, because they never will, and most of us probably don't want them to, right? We like the marketplace of ideas. We sort of like the tussle. And so that's the balancing act that a Biden administration is going to have to face. I don't think they have a full plan or strategy for China yet. They can see a little way down the road, but only a little. And I think we'll go mostly for a return to normalcy by a cessation for the time being of new provocations to China. China, however, as I said, is on the move. And China really is a techno-totalitarian state whose foreign policy, even though they believe this is a story about Chinese virtue, as I've said, whose foreign policy is to make the world more amenable to a Chinese Communist Party that's increasingly repressive at home and aggressive internationally. So do we have the wherewithal? Can we come together to, yes, do what we have to do domestically, while also trying to reassert American influence around the world, especially vis-a-vis China? This would be an enormous challenge for any administration. Lastly, and again, and that be further than that, I cannot see. I would say, I've been all around the country. I say yes to all the World Affairs Council invitations. It's a great organization. We need to nationalize the issue. Washington needs to hear more from the communities around the United States, which have a direct stake in how we manage our foreign relations, and which also have a lot to contribute to that. Washington needs to know what localities see as both the costs and the opportunities of involvement with China. And I'm afraid that right now, Washington is not listening to the rest of the country. It's mostly listening to security hawks in both parties, who see China only as a security challenge to the United States. My own view is that China is a very complex human proposition, of which one increasingly important feature is the security challenge. But that's not all there is to say about it. And it's at the community level that you're really involved, through universities, through businesses, in many cases through parishes, with the relationship at the ground level. And I've hoped, in fact, I've spoken to the World Affairs Council leadership about this. I think the councils could have a somewhat bigger voice and could conceive of their missions a little bit differently, and not just, I really value the chance to talk to you, but it shouldn't just be people like me, leading seminars with you. It should also be the World Affairs Council saying to Washington, now listen up, bub, because there's a lack of balance right now. And so I hope in the future you'll think about that in Reading. Thank you. You're still muted, Saul.
I'm not muted.
There you go.
So thank you very, very much, Robert. Really wonderful. And we have, I could almost say, a plethora of questions that have been coming in, and we'll try to do some justice with this. Dr. Randall Newham, one of our board members, asked early on about Hong Kong's autonomy. Is it a thing of the past? Should we just acknowledge openly that it's gone? And another board member, Dave Hewitt, asked in a parallel way about Taiwan, about its long-term prospects for autonomy, if that's really what, I mean, the verbalization is no, we're all one China, but can you comment on both Hong Kong and Taiwan?
Yes, they're related, but very different cases. First, Hong Kong. And it gives me no pleasure to say this. I've been in Hong Kong, can't even count, 30 or 40 times before the handover and after. Yes, I do think it's over in Hong Kong. Neither the United States nor the outside world, nor the people of Hong Kong themselves hold any cards. Okay, in 1997, Hong Kong reverted from being a British colony to being a special administrative region of the People's Republic of China. And it's the of the, which is all that matters. It is part of China, irrevocably so. And it will be and become what the Communist Party of China wants it to be and become. And over the past several years, the Communist Party has become convinced that unless it cracks down and essentially makes Hong Kong, as the phrase goes, just another Chinese city, that Hong Kong is going to be a hotbed of discontent, criticism, and potentially revolution aimed at the power of the Communist Party. And they're not going to let that happen. It's very clear. So I'm afraid that there's just not very much we can do about that anymore. And again, it always helps, although these analogies are never perfect, to turn it around. Suppose that China over this past summer decided it was deeply concerned about Portland, Oregon, and the chaos there and what was going on there and the way that demonstrators were being treated. And what if the National People's Congress of China started passing sense of the National People's Congress resolutions about how badly Washington was treating Portland, and if would the Chinese start to ask themselves whether really they should have a separate Portland policy apart from its United States policy? Well, that puts the ridiculousness of our position perhaps in too stark a relief. The histories are very different, but from China's point of view, it's rather like that. So our foreign policy works under the Westphalian system. It's based at countries as the basic building block. We don't have an England policy and a Manchester policy, nor does it really make much sense to have a China policy and a Hong Kong policy. With reference to Hong Kong, with reference to Xinjiang, where the Uyghurs are being imprisoned, with reference to Tibet, all three of those are fully part of the People's Republic of China, and we acknowledge them as such. And what that means is that if you care about the freedom and autonomy of the people in those places, you have to care about the freedom and autonomy of all Chinese, because only when all of China, if and when it has political pluralism, will these sub-regions have any chance of having more autonomy. Now, Taiwan is a different case. Taiwan is not within the People's Republic of China, and it never has been. It is an independent nation state in all but name. And we largely treat it as such. It is, I think, our 11th biggest trading partner. It's a vibrant, mature democracy. It's the manufacturer of the world's leading silicon chips. We work very, very closely with them. It is a place that we are right to cherish and to want to support. It's also the single biggest flashpoint where we could potentially find ourselves at daggers drawn with China, because China sees this as the last bit of unfinished business from the century of humiliation. Mentioned the century of humiliation. Taiwan was taken as a war prize by Japan at the end of the 19th century and remained a Japanese colony until the end of World War II, after which, as you know, it became the refuge of Chiang Kai-shek. And then with the launch of the Korean War in 1950, it became, in essence, an American protectorate. But as far as China is concerned, this is unfinished business. This is still part of China's civil war. And that's not a metaphor. The government feels that as real, as in its bones. And so our policy has been one of strategic ambiguity, of doing as much as we could to assist Taiwan. But we have wanted, under the One China policy, to maintain strategic ambiguity, meaning that we wouldn't say for sure whether we would defend Taiwan if it came to war across the straits. We want China to think that we might, so that China doesn't attack Taiwan. And we want Taiwan to think that we might not defend Taiwan, because if they know that we will, then they might declare independence and provoke Beijing, and we could be in World War III. So this has been a delicate balancing act, but it has been successful since 1979. The question now is whether it's still sustainable. And a lot of people in Washington think that it is not sustainable for a very specific reason. Xi Jinping, who is now China's president for life, has said that the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation must be completed by 2049, which is the centenary of the forming of the People's Republic of China. In a separate speech, he has said that the reunification with Taiwan is essential to the rejuvenation of the great Chinese nation. Now, he's never quite done the math and put those two parts of the equation together, but that math is easy even for me to do. It sounds like a deadline for reunification, namely 2049, which is not far off. And a deadline for reunification is a threat of war at a date certain. And so there are a number of people in Washington who are convinced that China is going to move on Taiwan with either a blockade or war, within the next 2 to 5 years, and believe the United States has to be prepared for that. I don't think that those Chinese moves are an inevitability. I think that this requires more deft management and better diplomacy from the United States moving forward. We can talk, that's a lot more to say, but I'll try to give shorter answers. These are all big questions.
Okay. Well, as I say, lots of questions still rolling in. Sort of a general question here from Sylvia Klett, interested in how might the new administration change our current policies with China? You've addressed some of that, but do you have anything you'd like to add?
Well, I think there will be more continuity than change. The basic strategic disposition toward China is not going to change. So I said that we're involved in a global, long-term, comprehensive competition with China. That is going to remain the same. Distrust has greatly deepened. President-elect Biden has said a number of times that there are still areas in which we can and must compete with China, that we can and must cooperate with China even as we compete. Global pandemics, terrorism is a major issue, nuclear non-proliferation. There are a number of areas in which we have to work with China. And of course, we still trade with China extensively. They're our #1 trading partner. And the Trump administration has not spoken of cooperation with China, even though we have in fact continued to cooperate. So the Biden administration has said, let's cooperate. There is a question about whether China itself will permit real constructive cooperation while we are also fiercely competing. Let me give you an example. Beijing is scheduled to host the Winter Olympics in 2022 in Beijing. The Biden campaign about 2 months ago said that what China is doing to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang is genocide, a position the Trump administration never quite took. They've flirted with it, but they haven't said it. Well, if this is genocide, should the United States go to the 2022 Olympics? I think that many Americans would say that we shouldn't. If we ban the Olympics and continue to call this genocide, will China be willing to cooperate, say, on climate change issues? This is an open question. China is feeling its oats. I say it's confident, and it thinks we're in decline. So the Biden administration is more open to cooperation, but of course, China gets a say in whether they actually cooperate.
I think you're beginning to answer some of the questions that are rolling in for some of your other comments there, but from Tom Westner, do you think, following up what you've just said, the way that the Trump administration has confronted China has been effective?
Not yet. There's quite a bit. It's confronted China in various ways. The people who have been running Trump's China policy at the National Security Council, I think, are very well informed, knowledgeable, Chinese speakers, not anti-China from their bones. They have real long experience in China and learned the language. Learning the Chinese language is hard. You only do this if there's a lot you like about China, right? So the people at the NSC have been, I think, pretty clear-eyed and strategic about China. The problem has really been the president himself. Mixed messages, a lack of message or strategic discipline. And the greatest failure of the Trump administration, I would say, has not been in its strategic disposition toward China. I think the Trump administration has been very helpful there. It's that while it has said China is our biggest problem, in fact, it hasn't prioritized China. Because prioritizing China would mean lightening up on our allies and partners, instead of conducting a war of all against all. Early in the Trump administration, I'd encourage you to look back at it, when McMaster was the national security advisor and Gary Cohn was still the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. They co-wrote a piece, which was sort of a short Trump foreign policy manifesto, I think in the Wall Street Journal. I may be misremembering, but it's easy enough to find, in which they said, there is no such thing as the global community. There are only sovereign states that defend their own interests, the sort of war of all against all. Well, that's not how the rest of the world sees it. And as I said, I'm in regular dialogues with people, Asia, Europe. They agree with us about China. They are also concerned about Chinese illiberalism, about China the ways that China wants to reshape the world. But they cannot cooperate with us when we're also, for example, saying that Canadian iron imports are a national security threat. When we're threatening to tariff automobiles, aluminum, steel, this sort of capricious approach of attacking all allies at once, they won't work with us. And so that's something that Biden can turn around relatively quickly. That doesn't solve the problem. It's the necessary but insufficient condition for managing the U.S.-China relationship well.
Backtracking just a bit here with the situation with the Uyghurs, and I believe you may have characterized it as genocide. That's a question from Reynold Newham also. Would you comment, when we speak of genocide, is it cultural genocide or is it physical genocide? Okay, let's put the question there.
Great question, and very policy relevant. I went back, and I'm not a lawyer of any kind. I'm certainly not a lawyer in international law. I did go back and read the United Nations statutes on genocide, which were written after World War II in response to the Holocaust. And the language there is very unclear as to what constitutes a genocide. And I think that it is possible both to read it as saying that this is a genocide and to read it as saying that it is not a genocide. One of the great omissions in the statute, it speaks of certain acts that may allow government suppression of distinct peoples to be classified as genocide, and which would certainly apply to the Uyghur case. But the statute is vague as to what scale, those acts on what scale constitute a genocide. The statute also doesn't use this phrase, cultural genocide. That's just a way of speaking. It's like calling somebody a moral leper, right? They don't really have leprosy. Cultural genocide is not a crime under international law. It's used for this is really, really, really bad. So putting the legalistic question aside, yes, this is cultural genocide. There's no question about it. Regarding the Uyghurs, regarding the Tibetans, both of whom, these areas, both of which, China's very nervous about both of them. And they have the same strategy toward both of these vast areas full of relatively small populations of relatively poor people. They have two strategies. One is to flood the zone, to have more and more Han Chinese move into Tibet and Xinjiang until the natives become minorities in their own region. And their second strategy, through various means, is forced assimilation. And then behind that now, they have the surveillance state. They have techno-totalitarianism to monitor and punish. This, and I hate to say this, again, I'm not talking about what I wish, I'm talking about what I think is, this is going to work. This works. Again, no perfect historical analogies, but what we did to the American Indian isn't too far off. Many of us might agree that in a morally perfect world, we should give Oklahoma back to the Cheyenne, and we also know it isn't going to happen, right? That, you read history and these are the sorts of things that happen. So yes, I do think that it is an attempt to obliterate peoples as distinct peoples with agency. As distinct peoples with agency. Beijing is happy to have Xinjiang and Tibetans as such, as sort of ornaments who have different languages and sing and dance and wear colorful outfits. They like all of that, difference as decoration stuff. But they are going to lose their nationhood or their identity as a people insofar as a people needs to have agency. And I again, no pleasure in it, but I think these are lost causes within China's borders. They hold all the cards.
We participate in a program, the Great Decisions Program through the World Affairs Council. Yeah. Okay, you're familiar with it.
Very.
This past year, one of the readings was on China and Latin America, and tying it somewhat to the Belt and Road Initiative, in the sense of sea power being part of the Belt and Road. So that's one question. And also from Blair Seitz, asking you to comment on China's presence in Africa. So maybe can you give some thoughts on both Latin America and Africa?
Sure. Quick note, if there's a lot of interest in your group in these questions about Xinjiang and Tibet, you've got one of America's leading scholars there at Penn State. I don't know if you've had David Atwell in to speak with you.
No.
David Atwell, who's actually right now doing a fellowship at the Wilson Center, but this is his field as a historian, but he knows the contemporary issues as well. And so if you wanted to do a deeper dive on China's periphery, primarily Xinjiang and Tibet, but even Inner Mongolia, then I would encourage you, and I can send you, I've got his email. I'll be seeing him virtually this Friday. That would be a terrific discussion for you. So David Atwell at Penn State. So Latin America, Africa, Belt and Road. Yes, China has been doing a tremendous amount of lending on these continents, primarily for infrastructure projects. And it hopes to use that lending for infrastructure to tie Africa and to tie Latin America into a more China or Sino-centric world. And this is done in various ways. One of them is by indebtedness. You owe China a lot of money. They draw you closer and you're in their sphere. Also, when you buy Chinese packages, whether it's for a road or a railroad or an airport or a port, or even what China calls a smart city or a safe city, the way this works is that China first lends you a whole lot of money, more than you can get probably from the World Bank or the IMF or the Asian Development Bank. Then through a closed tendering system, meaning private agreements, you, the borrowing country, use that money to hire Chinese companies and Chinese labor to build your asset, whatever that may be. So when they build that asset, they do so with Chinese tech, whether it's 5G or Chinese gauge rail or whatever it might be. And so this ties you into Chinese standards. And much of the US-China competition is increasingly a competition for standards. And so, yes, China is doing this. It's leveraging its wealth to build its influence. The formula of Chinese foreign policy is deference through dependence. That's what this is looking at. Okay. Is this unmitigated evil? No, it's not unmitigated evil. It's very concerning to us, but in many poor parts of the world, although there have been a lot of issues with China's Belt and Road lending, this again is an entirely separate discussion, which I'd be happy to have with you. It's a separate discussion. It's too complex. They are bringing real public goods to parts of the world as well, right? So this can work. So when we look at Latin America and when we look at Africa and when we worry about what China is doing there, the real issue, in my view, is not Chinese activity, but American inactivity. It's that we're not there. It's that we are not offering options or shaping behaviors. Instead, we are offering sermons on the virtues of democracy, openness, certain kinds of development patterns, fill it in. So this to me is the real issue. Not what China's doing, it's what we're not doing. And I must say that even looking at the Biden team's foreign policy prescriptions as they come in, America once again is saying nothing about Central Asia, nothing about the continent of Africa, nothing about Latin America. We just seem to have on these permanent blinders in both parties, as though the world order, can ignore Africa, the world's fastest growing continent, or Latin America, which we should see as an asset, but we fail to. So this to me is mostly about our failures, not China's strategies.
Could you comment on China's aging population? The one-child policy for several generations. Now, I believe it's changing. But is that, as it is with Japan, as I understand it, is that a threat existentially for China?
So, it's interesting. The term existential threat, which has always been around, has had a lot more currency the past few years. Yeah. It's a big, of course, China would still exist, but the demographics, the aging population, is one of many factors that could really put the brakes on China's development and leave it in something like what's called the middle income trap, not quite making it. So yes, China does have a rapidly aging population because of the one-child policy. They do not have a full social safety net in place, and they don't yet have an answer to this. They know about it. China has terrific demographers and economists. They're looking at this. But they're going to have far more pensioners or retirees with very, very high expectations for material standard of living, supported by an ever smaller group of working age people. You're correct that they have lifted the one China policy. They went to 2, but the Chinese fertility rate is still, I think it's actually slightly less than 1 child per couple. What China has found is what every other nation has found, which is that economic development is the best form of birth control. The wealthier a country is, no matter what its cultural background, the fewer children people have. And young, wealthy Chinese are making the same decision. They have a few levers that they can use. There's a little time to try to improve the social safety network. And China has the financial means to do this. It's a question of priorities, right? They face a guns and butter issue, just as we do. That's one. Number 2 is that some Chinese policymakers, like American policymakers, whenever there's a question that they can't answer, you just invoke the technology genie, right? That we will somehow, if the need is great enough, we'll somehow innovate our way out of it. But then there are other things they can do, including, and this one can delay the problem, possibly enough to get them over the hump. China has very, very low mandatory retirement ages, very low. Many people in China, women often retire at about 50. Men retire at between 55 and 60, some sooner. And so what some Chinese policymakers are proposing is just later retirement. They have space that we don't really have to reasonably redefine who is a retiree and who is in the workforce, because they've had such an early retirement age. Now, it's not as simple as that, because they also don't have enough employment opportunities for their growing number of college graduates. There are a number of constraints on China. Pollution is one. And he says, what's an existential threat if by that we mean something that can bring the party to a close? Demographics is huge. Corruption of the government is one. Staggering levels of debt, especially among local governments. Pollution, air, water, and land. Air is the quickest to clean up. Water, impossible, but we can imagine how to do it technologically. China's land pollution problem. Salinization due to overuse of nitrogen and phosphate fertilizers. No one knows how to get out of that one. The water shortage in the north of China, another big problem. And then sclerotic politics, a one-party system that may not be adequate for a young, vibrant international government. All of these are China's great constraints that should lower our level of anxiety, not entirely, but a little bit. But yeah, demographics at the very top of that list.
All right, we have maybe about 5 minutes remaining, and at least one or two questions, Andre Berrier and one or two others, just trying to address China's military might. And perhaps in the context of the other discussions you've been leading us with in terms of cooperating with China, where have we been cooperating with China relative to North Korea?
The answer over the past year and a half has largely been no. We've been doing mostly nothing about North Korea, and it appears to be a tacit agreement in which, as long as Kim doesn't push too far, we won't make too much noise. And we have also, of course, been frying lots of other fish. So that's sort of left dangerously in limbo with a lot of factors that could get us back into the old cycle of provocation. Our interests with China and North Korea are not wholly commensurate. They would prefer that North Korea not have nuclear weapons, but at this point, that's really done. That's fait accompli. They've succeeded in that. They want to bring North Korea in line where we want to bring North Korea to its knees. They don't want North Korea brought to its knees. They want North Korea to exist as a buffer state between China and the American alliance system in South Korea. They also have a deep, profound history of cooperation with North Korea, even though that's never been all that friendly. There's a lot of suspicion. They don't see a collapse in North Korea as in their interest, and they see America's missteps and distraction there as serving their interests. So there's no acute issue in North Korea right now. It can flare up, but there's no acute issue that China is trying to solve. And they like demonstrations of our inefficacy. They like our distraction. That all works out. And if it's Kim who's providing the distraction and not them, as long as it stays within bounds, that's fine by China. So on the one hand, we know that there can't be any sustainable solution to tensions on the Korean Peninsula unless China supports it. That's certainly true at the end game. But right now we have interests in China, some of which overlap, but some of which are in conflict with each other. And again, we haven't been paying attention to it. We haven't been doing diplomacy. It was just, Trump said, I'll meet with Kim. We fell in love. Oh, that didn't work. Not so much about meeting with Kim. So this is why I talk about enabling the expert foreign affairs bureaucracy, because that is the tool for keeping attention to and pressure on all fronts simultaneously. The president himself and even his National Security Council can't do that. There just aren't enough hours in the day.
All right, final question, I think, and this is sort of an American question, but it's from Dr. Paul Escueda. As Americans, he's not saying it this way, I'm paraphrasing him. We like to be liked, and we have all of these, we still have so many students from China coming to study here in the United States. Is there any kind of conclusion to be drawn from that culturally or in terms of the long-range relationships we have with China?
So this is, yet again, a huge question. It deals with this issue of what's called soft power. Liking to be liked, the powers of attractive powers instead of coercive powers. And yes, the student question is enormous. I just wrote a chapter for an upcoming book on this. And this is another topic that we could do a separate section on soft power if you wanted to, or just on the student question. They're enormous. It's been complicated more recently because China does, in fact, build what it calls its comprehensive national power and conduct various forms of espionage through in part through some Chinese in America, including students, including more especially Chinese scholars who are here on short-term visits. We haven't figured out how to deal with this for precisely the reason that the question raises. America has benefited enormously by the Chinese brain drain over the past 40 years. So we have these wonderful new Americans making essential contributions to every aspect of American society, and it's absolutely to our benefit. At the edges of that, we're now so more aware of China's efforts to use that as a vulnerability, which it can be. So what's the right degree of constructive vigilance against that that doesn't demonize the hundreds of thousands or millions of people who are contributing to the United States, and it doesn't result in racial profiling of Chinese in the United States? How can we be sufficiently vigilant without telling what is probably the world's biggest talent pool, namely young Chinese seeking education, that they're a despised class in the United States? And the problem here, as I've said, is that the discussion of China policy is mostly being driven by security hawks. And security hawks, many of them, not all, tend to speak with reference to this question and a lot of others, as though the only acceptable level of risk is zero. But risk is never zero, right? We know the benefits of Chinese coming here are enormous, and we know that the risk is real. And we're trying to figure out how to gauge that and respond to it, and we don't really have a satisfactory answer yet. So this is dynamic. This is a moving target, this question, a very important question.
Well, thank you, Robert. I assure you, because I've been watching our participation rates, we haven't lost a soul since you started. So you've really captured our attention, and we deeply appreciate your willingness to be with us. We're going to have to find a way to get you to make that drive to Reading some point for another presentation.
It's just right. You don't even have to get me a hotel room. I can be up there and back in a day. Not that I wouldn't like to spend the night, but it's easy. It's a good distance for me.
Well, that's what we do. So we'll keep that in mind when we can reopen with this sort of thing.
Sure.
So, so to conclude here, again, thank you very, very much. And to our people attending, we always have a nice little gift representing our Pennsylvania Dutch culture, created by a local artisan. We're going to send that to Robert, and as our small way of saying thank you very much for this. Upcoming, folks, and Robert, you may be interested in this as well, is coming Thursday at 10 a.m. We are having a presentation on NATO from the European perspective by Michael Baranowski. He is the director of the German Marshall Fund based in Warsaw, and he will provide he provides overall strategic direction and leadership for the organization's work in Poland, the Baltic states, and the V4 countries of the Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, and Slovakia. December 9 at noon, that's a Wednesday, John Dernbach is going to be with us on the topic of climate change. Mr. Dernbach is the director of the Environmental and Sustainability Center and an internationally recognized authority on sustainability development, climate change, and environmental law. And then finishing this year, Randy, send me that note again if I misspoke. This coming presentation is Thursday, the 19th. I think I've said that correctly. So December 16, Wednesday at noon, James Olson speaking on My Friend the Spy, the notorious case of FBI Special Agent Robert Hanssen, who was convicted of spying for the Soviet Union and its successor and is now serving a life sentence because of that. And as we always do to conclude here, our membership, we're always interested in folks becoming members with us. Your membership helps us sustain these kinds of presentations. Our speakers are very inexpensive. In fact, they don't charge us, but we do have other associated costs. And it's a way for you to commit yourself to our civic endeavor here in our corner of Pennsylvania. So we urge you to visit our website and learn more about our upcoming programs, all what we are about, and certainly consider becoming a member of the World Affairs Council of Greater Reading. It's a good bargain and a good way for you to substantiate and commit yourselves to our civic endeavors. Once again, Robert, we thank you very, very much. Much appreciated. And good speed to you. Good day, and good day to everyone.
Thank you. I enjoyed it, and I'd be very, very glad to come back and do a deeper dive on some of these questions. Just give me a holler.
We will remember that.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.